So next we have Sarah Parks. Sarah.
Hi, my name is Sarah Parks and I work at RAND Europe, which is a not-for-profit policy research institute in the UK, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the use of open peer review. So before I get started, I want to give a little bit of background to my work and where the data I'm going to talk about kind of comes from. So between January 2016 and March 2017, I was involved in a project for the European Commission to develop a pilot online monitor to track different trends in open science. And for those of you, most of you are aware, but open science is the move towards greater transparency, sharing and collaboration within the kind of research community. So this was a large collaborative project which involved bringing data that says something about the development of open science together from a wide range of sources into one place. And the wheel shown on the screen shows at a high level what's tracked on the monitor. So we focused on three characteristics of open science: open access to publications, open research data, and open scholarly communications. And within these areas, we have specific indicators which show, where possible, the behaviors or practices within the areas, the journal and funder policies, and the attitudes of researchers. And so within open scholarly communications, one of the things we looked at was open peer review. And this is both in terms of the behaviors of researchers and also in terms of journal policies. So this is what I'm going to show you today. As the primary aim of the pilot monitor was to test the feasibility of collecting appropriate data and not really to analyze the data. This is mainly a descriptive talk about the data. Okay, so what is open peer review? I guess many people in the room have quite a good idea about what open peer review is. But what I wanted to highlight is that open peer review is an umbrella term for a large number of non-traditional and more open ways of conducting peer review. So there was a systematic review done earlier this year, which looked at about 120 definitions for open peer review, and 95% of them have one of the top two things on the slide in them. So open identities, which is reviewers revealing their name to authors and vice versa, and open reporting, so reviews being published alongside articles at some point during the process. And we look at these two elements. In the context of monitoring open science, what we wanted to know is what's happening in open peer review. So specifically, what forms of open peer review are being used by journals, but also what do researchers maybe want to do. Do uses of open peer review vary by discipline or in a European context by country? And the big question in open science terms in monitoring is peer review becoming more open? So we used two sources of data for open peer review. So firstly, Publons, which many of you are probably familiar with. It's an online platform which allows reviewers to record their peer reviews and provides a verified record of peer review activity. We obtained two sets of data. So we obtained journal policies on peer reviews. So are authors allowed or required to sign their reviews, and are authors allowed or required to publish the reviews? And then also user data on the data in Publons, how many of the reviews are published openly. So these data allow us to look at kind of a global picture, like the landscape of open peer review, but it doesn't necessarily tell you what researchers would choose to do. So we also obtained data from PeerJ, which is an open access journal that gives reviewers the option to sign their reviews, and it also gives authors the option to publish the review history with the article. So before I get into the data in detail, I want to just list a number of kind of important caveats when interpreting the results. So starting with the Publons data, it's important to note that data aren't necessarily representative for all countries, disciplines, open peer reviews. Kind of by definition, the data are for users of Publons, who are probably not representative of all peer reviewers. Publons estimated at the time that we took this data that had about 1% of the reviews, which done globally, which is a small percentage, but still quite a large number. Publons as a platform is obviously used more in some countries than others, so you have to be careful when you look at the country data, how you interpret it. And the journal policy data that we got at the time covered approximately 12% of journals worldwide, and of course these may not be representative. The use of Publons is also growing over time, and this both in terms of the users and the relationships Publons has with publishers. So this means that the data is not necessarily always representative and that this might change over time. And then just for PeerJ, the data we have covers the 2 PeerJ journals, one in biology and one in computer sciences. So we have to be careful if we generalize it beyond these kind of journals. It's also important to note that these are open access journals, so they're being used by people publishing open access, which may mean people are more likely to carry out other open science practices. But despite these caveats, I think the data still give an interesting initial insight into the use of open peer review. So let's have a look at some of the data. So starting with the policy data. So we had data on 3,692 journals. Of these, 3.5% allow or require reviewers to sign their reviews, and 2.3% allow or require peer reviews to be published. As you can tell, these are quite small numbers. This graph shows this data by discipline, split into 5 different disciplines. The size of the bubble corresponds to the number of journals, so the bigger the bubble, the more journals we had information on. You can see that in general, more journals allow or require signing than allow or require publishing of reviews. And this is true for all disciplines apart from arts and humanities, which, as you can see, is a very small bubble. So it's the one we kind of have least data on. So that's, I guess, what journals allow, and that obviously affects what users can do. But what does that then look like in terms of use of people on Publons? So this graph shows the percentage of reviews published openly on Publons. That's the blue line. On average, 1.7% of the reviews in Publons are published openly. And as you can see, there's no evidence at the moment that this is going up over time. The red line, so one thing that you can do on Publons as a author or as a reviewer is to say, I would like this to be published openly, and then sometimes journals wouldn't allow that, so then it doesn't get published openly. And so that's what the red line is showing. It's important to note these might be the same reviewers who publish openly elsewhere, but these journals then don't allow it. So very briefly, a kind of a country level. This map shows the percentage of reviews published openly. We only show countries with more than 100 unique reviewers and Publons. That's kind of a decision that we made. You can see that the percentages range from around 0 to 14 in Saudi Arabia, with most countries come out about 1 to 5%. Obviously, you have to be careful if you want to generalize this data beyond just people on Publons. And what about by discipline? So by discipline, you can see that all the percentages are quite small, so 2% is the highest, and the discipline that came out highest is life sciences. So far I've shown data at like the global level, where often authors and reviewers don't necessarily get to choose the peer review process they go through. But what about in a journal where reviewers and authors get to choose the level of openness? So this graph shows data from PeerJ of the percentage of reviews which authors choose to publish, which is in blue, and the percentage of reviewers that choose to name themselves, which is in red. You can see that the blue line comes out about 70%-ish, and the red line at about 40%. PeerJ was launched in 2013. Its use has been growing over time. It's interesting to see that as this has been happening, there hasn't been an enormous change in the use of its open peer review features. And if anything, use might be slightly decreasing. And it will be interesting to see how this develops over time. So in conclusion, open peer review is obviously something which is happening in different forms, but it still seems to account for a small percentage of reviews carried out worldwide. And in both a global sense and in a local sense, the data we have at the moment doesn't indicate that open peer review is necessarily taking off, although obviously in PeerJ there is quite high uptake of some of the options. So I'd just like to finish by saying a big thank you to Publons and PeerJ for providing the data, and hopefully I will continue to work with them to look at kind of, as they now have a lot more data on this.
Thank you, Sarah. Questions? Why do you think this is? Why do you think it's not taking off?
Well, I mean, I guess one of the things is that, so one thing I think would be interesting to look more at is kind of researcher attitudes. So we have the PeerJ data, which shows what happens in a journal where people are given choice. And there was recently a survey that looked at people, most of whom had done some form of open peer review, that showed that many of them think open peer review is the future. So I think it's about whether journals allow people to do it, I think, in some senses.
Thanks.
Chris Papes in Kansas City. I, like many other editors, have the impression, although I've not seen data to support that impression, that it's more difficult to find reviewers today than it was years back. Is there any data regarding open peer review in the form of somebody actually signing a review that indicated it is more difficult? Because I think it would be tremendously more difficult to get people to agree to review under those conditions.
So I don't have any data on that. I think it's a really interesting question, and that's definitely something that you hear a lot anecdotally that people are worried about.
And it's the topic of our next presentation, so we get some data from that. Yep.
So the peer review process can be thought of as a whole series of good faith agreements. The author submits their paper in good faith, the journal acts in good faith to responsibly review the paper, and the reviewers especially are acting in good faith to in some ways provide their intellectual input or intellectual property to the author to improve their paper. So to what degree, if we're going to move to open review, should the reviewers sign off on allowing the author to review and post, and in some case comment critically, publicly on their input?
I think that's a good question. So I don't really know the answers to that, but I think it's interesting that in PeerJ, it is the authors that get to choose whether the reviews are published rather than the reviewers, which is different from, say, the data on Publons, where the reviewers are choosing.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Amy Price from the BMJ and from Oxford University. And I thank you for your beautiful presentation. It's great. I'm all for open peer review. The one thing that I see coming up, though, is sometimes peer reviewers whose names are given in the article are quite viciously attacked on social media, and also editors as well. So I'm wondering if, as a community, at the Peer Review Congress, if there's any way that we could set in place some kind of a strategy to protect the peer reviewers, especially young career researchers where it may affect their later career, and patient reviewers, of course, and also editors from this kind of, nastiness. If there's some kind of stand that we could take as to just saying that that this was unacceptable, or if there could be some repercussions. I'm just throwing it out there so we can think about it, and really appreciate your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Amy. Any thoughts on that? Others may have suggestions. Yeah.
Theo Bloom from BMJ. There's a little minor storm going on Twitter because yesterday Crossref announced providing DOIs for peer review reports in a particular category. And when I posted that, people are saying, but COPE says you have to keep peer reviews confidential. I said, well, I'm coming from this perspective of open peer review where once published, they're not confidential, so people can take credit for them and so on. But there's obviously still a lot of confusion about who has the right to claim, post, or otherwise deal with peer review. I think Chris Graff from COPE is here, and maybe he'd like to comment on why COPE says all reviews have to remain confidential permanently, even if they're published. I mean, we just seem to have some confusion about who can do what with
Thanks,
reviews.
Thea. Calling Chris from COPE. Please do, but I'll just, while you get to the microphone, we'll just take...
Hilda Bastian from PubMed Commons. My question was essentially the same, and thanks, Sarah, for showing that, and it's logical that the people who wanted to share their peer reviews in Publons wanted them to be open, and the journal policy wouldn't allow it. I understand what the argument is to justify saying that a journal can say an article is, can't be sort of published if it's a firewall journal. But I don't even understand what the rationale is for why a peer review that you wrote yourself is not, you don't have the copyright for it. And I don't know if anyone can answer that. I mean, I'd actually like to know what the rationale is.
I can give a rationale, but maybe others could too, at the back, and then we'll come to Chris.
Irene Hames. I'll leave Chris to clarify the COPE things because there is confusion on that, and then maybe I'll step in because I drafted the original COPE ethical guidelines for peer reviewers, in which that comment was put, but it is very carefully worded that things are not allowed to be released beyond what the journal allows. And this also speaks to the data because it's not actually the reviewers who are choosing to make them open or not. In the Publon's data, in the data, it's the journal publishers and the editors who are choosing that, whatever the reviewer may want to do. So I think we have that conflation. And so I think, if you ask the reviewers what they would actually like to do, because POJ, obviously, the authors have the choice, the reviewers can do it. But I should also say a little bit of a plug for the session at the end of the conference. We're going to be talking in the transparency and peer review session at 5:30. We're going to be actually talking about a lot of these issues.
Thank you. Chris.
Righto. Chris Graff, co-chair of COPE. So my understanding of the COPE guidelines is that the guideline, there are multiple parts of the guideline, but the part that refers to confidentiality of peer review actually simply states that the conditions under which the peer review was provided to the journal should be respected by the peer reviewer. It doesn't say that the peer reviewer shall not provide their comments or publish their comments elsewhere. It just says that the peer reviewer should respect the conditions under which those comments were provided to the journal.
Thank you, that's very clear. I don't know, it's a bit mean of me, but if Elizabeth Loder's in the room, you might want to share our difficulties we've had about the peer review comments on papers that aren't accepted and how they might, in answer to Hilda's point, but just to call out.
Robert Danziger from Chicago. A general comment. The overall sort of thing, writing thing is that the incentive for peer review is primarily to be a good member of the scientific community. And I'm wondering if by using people's names and so forth, you may be able to increase that so that there's some, rational benefit that a peer reviewer gets. It's sort of like Wikipedia. Why do people contribute to Wikipedia? What do they get out of it?
Yeah, no, I think that's one of the reasons, particularly in the survey I mentioned earlier, that people think open peer review is the way forward.
Thank you very much indeed.